Hello there, what is going on, everyone? Today we are asking the question, should game developers be able to compete in their own games? We are talking about high-level tournaments, things above the level of like maybe a small store championship, and but maybe even store championships. Again, there's not really a definitive line, but I think when we look at grand championships, regional championships, national championships, and world championships, and tournaments on that level, if you are someone who has designed or developed a game or expansions or content for a game, should you then be able to turn around and compete in a tournament of that game? It's an interesting question that has seen a lot of discussion lately, and I wanted to make a video about it because I thought it'd be a very cool topic to talk about, and I'd love to hear from you guys and find out your take on it, because I think that answers to this question will be all across the spectrum, and I think it's an important question to ask and an important discussion to have. I don't expect to have the exact answer today, and I don't know if there is an exact right and wrong answer, but I think we might be able to get a little bit close and at least start the discussion. If you guys are new here to the channel, I talk a lot about games like X-Wing Armada, Star Wars Legion, a lot of Star Wars, Battlestar Galactica, all kinds of science fiction games, and a lot of like Warhammer stuff as well from time to time. I'd love to have you stick around. We're still doing that $25 Amazon gift card giveaway. There's time left to enter this current round. We've got a few more days left on this one, then a new one will kick off. If you want to have a chance to enter to win any of those, you just have to be a subscriber and leave a comment on one of my videos. I would love hear from you guys, and from you guys to hear, and from hearing you guys to from you guys, and I should edit all that out, but I'm just going to keep going. I'm going to truck on with it, because the video is not, can Crabbok speak incoherent sentences. It's, should developers compete in their own games? Let's get the discussion going. And if you like what you see and you want to stick around, or you want more, we have links in the video description below for our Discord, different social medias, the Facebooks, then the Blue Skies, and all of that stuff, and Patreon as well, if you're interested in maybe getting your name at the credits or different tiers, level of access, and things like that. All of that is down in the video description below. So, should developers be able to compete in their own games? Or should they compete, or should they be able to? I guess they're two different things, because I think there's a difference between being able to compete, like being allowed to, and should you still do it, right? Like, can like a 70-year-old man date an 18-year-old woman? They can, but should they? Who's to say? I'm not going to go there. I've been watching Modern Family lately, and you've got the whole Ed O'Neill and Sofia Vergara thing, and so it's a great show, by the way. Love that show. I don't know why I brought that into it, but that's how we shoot here on the channel. Sometimes there's a little bit of randomness. So I think there can be seen a conflict of interest, right? If you are a developer and you're making content, and then you then use that content in a competitive environment against other players, and I think there's two aspects of it. I think there's a familiarity aspect, because you may know the ins and outs of how this ship flies, or this tank shoots. You may know some of the tricks for it and the best strategies, but there's also the gameplay and the meta balance towards potentially making content that might make your competitive list or army or fleet even better. And I think that's where like the root of this comes in. And I think it seems like a no-brainer to some folks, but in the age of community-driven content, like we're seeing with X-Wing and Armada, where there's more and more communities coming up that are making their own homebrew, that are making their own very high-level homebrew. And I say homebrew, again, I don't necessarily mean that it was made with crayons. There's different tiers, and they're making very high-level homebrew that is tested, and they're running tournaments with it and stuff like that. So there's a lot of interesting discussions going on with how all that'll work. But one of the more recent discussions that's come up is, should designers and developers and the people who have made this stuff, should they be able to compete? So I think this is interesting, and for points of discussion here, I'm not necessarily talking about playtesters alone. Because I think there's a difference if you are there just to playtest, or if you are there to participate in the development process. And I think there's also some carryover because in some cases people do both. So in this, for purposes of this discussion, I want to talk about developers and designers and people who are working on stuff. Now, I have reached out and I've talked to the X-Wing Alliance. And so for the purposes of X-Wing, and at least in that particular group, which they do also put together high-level content and organized play and are doing their part in keeping X-Wing played. That their design team, and also they have a points rebalancing team, and the people that work on that content and creating that content do not compete in tournaments, and I respect that. They thought it wouldn't look good if they did. Now I don't know if that applies to like every possible tournament or if it's only the high level events. For example, I've played in some high level events like Gen Con and Worlds, but I've also played in a lot of like local store level events, that might have less than 20 people. So again, that's, I think there's a difference between like the small local casual tournaments and then the high level events. And then of course there's campaigns and casual meetup Friday or Star Wars Sunday or whatever it is that you play. And so those aren't necessarily what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the big level events, things like Nova or Gen Con or LVO or Adepticon, and the big tournaments. Should you be able to play in those different national championships that have been going on all around the world? So there's a lot of different grand tournament level events that are happening. And if one of those events is running a homebrew, if you're one of the developers of that homebrew, should you be able to compete in using that? And it's an interesting. Like I would certainly initially I would have said no for a long time, and probably would still say no. But I think the question is a little bit deeper than a simple yes or no, because of the fact that years ago, things were different. Let's look at when Fantasy Flight had X-Wing and Armada. You had developers like Max Brook and Alex Davey and Michael Gurnis and Brooks Pfluger-Levitt and all of these excellent folks working on these games. And you never saw them competing in Worlds. You never saw them competing in Nova or LVO or these grand tournament, these national tournament, regional tournament, and higher. You didn't see the game designers, the game developers creating content and then turning around and then playing in the competitive events like that. Not to say that they didn't play the game, and not to say that they couldn't necessarily compete in like their own, FFG local tournaments or playing at the game center or game center, things like that. So I'm sure that they, definitely did play the games quite a bit, because it's kind of part of the job. But you didn't see them you would see them at Worlds sometimes because they would have a presence there, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But fast forward to, and I think the same thing goes with Atomic Mass Games. Before we fast forward to today, imagine if you saw Will Schick from Atomic Mass Games out there winning the World Championships of Marvel Crisis Protocol, right? There's obviously a conflict of interest there. It's the same reason employees can't enter their painting competitions. You don't see, James Workshop winning the Golden Demon, right? You don't see, you don't see Dallas Kemp winning the Path of the Worthy and stuff like that, because again, obviously conflict of interest there. Not to mention also that these same game developers, if they wanted to compete in the tournaments, they're also the ones that also make the rules too. And so by de facto, their ruling would, kind of instantly become, the law of the land. And so it's, and that's another thing, is that these people are also making rules. I think in a lot of tournaments, there could be a distinction if you're working specifically on rules and not on cards, because I think once you enter a tournament, you're handing over control of the rules to the TO and the judges for the thing. So even if they are wrong and you are right, if you're a rules writer, you're like, no, that doesn't work that way. Well, the judge says, well, today it does, then you're at their mercy. But again, that could still even be a kind of a messy situation if it worked out. So fast forward to today, where these same games, we're talking X-Wing and Armada, are being created by community support. There is a distinction that is worth mentioning, is that times have changed. These games are now community driven, which means that the people who work on these games are volunteers. It means that these people are unpaid. To my knowledge, there isn't some, billionaire benefactor funding, X-Wing and Armada. I mean, who knows? It could be. But, again, it's a volunteer. It's a labor of love. It's an unpaid position to be able to do stuff like this. So I have seen people from the other side of the discussion suggest, these people are volunteering their time. Are we going to deny them the ability to, to play in Worlds or things like that? And I think that is an interesting metric for this discussion, is that if they are volunteering their time, do we actually want to punish them for that? And again, it's an interesting question. That's why I'm saying I don't necessarily have the definitive answer, because I think the answer is complex. But I would certainly lean towards, even though they're volunteers, again, all community contents are unpaid volunteer positions. Everybody who's done homebrew hasn't been paid for it, and unless somebody actually happened to commission you for it, which might sound a little weird. But yeah, these are all unpaid positions across the board. That being said, I would certainly lean towards probably still shouldn't compete, right? It's probably still shouldn't. If you're making stuff, and I'll give you an example of how, because it could be innocent. You might make stuff that is not even for a faction that you play, but you just think the game needs, and it doesn't impact you or the way you play at all. And that certainly could be the case. But let's say, for example, I was, let's say a certain homebrew community had, published their rule set. Let's say they were doing Worlds and said, okay, Worlds is going to run our homebrew, and our developers all place in the top 8, and one of our lead developers wins World Championships. What would the optics for that look like? How would that look? I think that would look pretty bad. Not only would it look bad, I think it would erode the confidence and the faith that the people have in those results and the validity of the tournament. Because, granted, you might know these folks, and you might know that, hey, they were just great players that also decided they wanted to work on the game. That could absolutely be true. It just doesn't look good. And I think that's enough of a reason on its own to say that it probably shouldn't happen. That's my opinion. You're free to agree with it. I'm wrong about stuff all the time, but I think I'm right about this. But that's my opinion. There are more sides to the story. But here's one example of how it could maybe spiral out of control. Let's say I was developing my, Crabbok reinforcements or whatever, and I was making my own homebrew, and I was running a tournament. And I said, you know what, I will use Star Wars Armada as an example. Let's say, I like to run without squadrons. Jay won this last Worlds without squadrons, and I'm more motivated than ever to really push for a squadronless build. But the biggest threat to me is Sloane, right? Maybe Sloane fleets just completely shred me. And so I decided to change Sloane to be a little less oppressive. I happen to not like Sloane very much. She works against my playstyle. She's super annoying, and maybe I want to make her critical effect reroll only apply against squadrons and doesn't apply against ships. She still has the other thing, but she doesn't have the reroll, so she can do less damage against ships. Maybe that's something that I'm looking to do. So let's say I redesigned Sloane, I push that change out there, and that could have a domino effect. It could turn Sloane lists into being a little bit less effective. It could turn Sloane lists into being maybe more mid-squadron that kind of work as an anti-squadron type of meta, and could lead to a wider presence of squadronless fleets. It could lead to less 134 squadron builds, and then also could increase my chances of actually making it through and winning enough games by wide enough margins that I can make the top 8 with a squadronless fleet, right? Again, I'm just picking some kind of off the wall example, because that would probably be clear, like, well, we know that you don't like Sloan, so, that change on its own wouldn't necessarily do that, and maybe it wouldn't. But most developers tend to develop more than just one card alone. There could be a pattern of things. There could be changes that suit a particular play style and are going to push a preferred group's play style over other play styles that were all balanced. For example, if you have rock, scissors, paper, and all the rocks start taking over and developing new content for rock, scissors, paper 2.0, and then all of a sudden, paper is nerfed and scissors is nerfed and only rock, then everybody's playing rock, the whole game, again, butterfly effect, right? Small changes can have really big impacts, especially a game like Star Wars Armada that is balanced surprisingly well for the amount of cards and ships that are in it. Not to say it's perfect, it's definitely got its issues, but it's one of the things that I think are worth thinking about, and one reason why I think that designers and developers shouldn't be able to compete at high-level events, because it does keep some of that bias and that conflict of interest out of it. If you're not going to be steering the game in a way that suits your play style, but steering in the game in a way that's best for everybody else, while you sit back and kind of observe your success, not by your own tournament success, but by the growth of the game. If you can look at those bigger numbers, and that's one of the things that FFG and AMG would do. Well, FFG would do is that they, the success matrix for them was largely about, hey, how well is the game doing? How well is it performing? What kind of numbers are we selling more? Are we getting more, clicks? Are we getting more engagement with the community? Is the game growing? That was what defined success for them. They had a whole different metric for how they looked at doing a good job when it came to content and new ships, new expansions, new content, all of that. It had nothing to do with how it was going to make Michael Gurnus's fleet perform in the next tournament, for example. So that's one of the things I think that is really at the, a major bullet point in, why developers should or should not be able to compete in their own games. And again, I'm not talking about playtesters alone, because playtesting is different. However, if you're a playtester that also does development, then I'm not talking to you. When I say playtesters stand apart from this, I'm talking about people who are strictly playtest that don't also do development or design, or even points for that matter, because that's still content, right? From a certain point of view, because you have to design what the points should be. That's still development. Even if it's a change or an errata to an existing card, that's still there. Again, if I make Architans 10 points cheaper, and now all of a sudden I can run 8 of them in a list, then I just did points, but I just enhanced my own play style by doing that. For example, I'm using a lot of examples of like me doing something because I'm not trying to target anyone in particular. This is just a talking point. Again, there may be some great arguments why they should be able to compete, because I know in a lot of these groups, the folks that have put these groups together are very passionate about the game, and some of them are largely competitive, and it might be a real feels bad to suddenly be told, hey, you're not going to be able to compete in this tournament, when that's kind of a very important thing for some of these folks. So what can they do? What can game developers and community content and homebrew developers do if it's an event that is running the rule set that they've got? Well, I think they can still attend. It doesn't mean they have to compete, but you can still attend. You can still be there. Again, one big part of these big events is also just the community and interacting with people. And maybe you do pickup games on the side. They can also judge. So you can attend, you could judge, you could stream, right? You could do commentary on stream. And you can promote the game. You can do there's a lot of stuff you can do surrounding a world tournament or a grand tournament, a national tournament. There's a lot of different ways that you can be involved and participate without actually competing. And this is where I mentioned FFG folks before, and AMG even. You will see them at these events. You will see them at these conventions. You'll see them at these big tournaments. But they're there in a support capacity, not necessarily in a competitive capacity. And I think that's a definitely a way to kind of bridge the gap. And there's also different side events that they can participate in. If you love the game and you want to play it, well, you can still go to these events. There are always side events. I have no problem with developers competing in side events, multiplayer events, casual events, thematic or cinematic events, demos. By the way, a lot of these events happen at conventions. If you are that passionate about the game, you could be running a demo booth, showing more people, getting more people involved. I've even seen Alex Davey play games against different content creators on camera, on videos. How many of those Team Covenant videos did you see where Alex Davey was, kind of playing against one of the other content creators that's out there to basically to demo the game? So there's lots of different ways that those things can happen. But I think it definitely is worth asking the question, should developers be able to compete in their own games? Be able to, and should they do it? Because not both of those might not be the same. Maybe they should be able to, but they should also opt out. Well, maybe it's the other way around. They shouldn't be able to, but they should do it anyway. They should break the rules. No, I don't. Maybe not that one. But I'd love to hear what you guys think. I've given you some of my thoughts on the whole discussion. I don't think it has to end here, though. Let me know what you think down in the comments section below. And you can jump in my Discord and keep the discussion going there as well. I'd love to talk more with you guys about it. And the discussion doesn't end here. So let's keep it going. Big thanks to all of you for watching. Big thanks to my patrons. You guys are amazing and help make this whole channel possible. I will talk to you soon. May the force be with you. Live long and prosper. Be excellent to each other. Party on, dudes. And always wash your socks.